Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation, has long been a melting pot of cultural diversity, economic potential, and political turbulence. The year 2024 saw the eruption of one of the most significant protest movements in the nation's history, the End Bad Governance protests. These protests, primarily driven by economic hardships and governmental policies perceived as oppressive, quickly gained traction across the country. The seeds of this protest were sown by the escalating cost of living, a consequence of a series of economic reforms introduced by President Bola Tinubu's administration. The removal of fuel subsidies, a cornerstone of Tinubu's economic policy, was intended to liberalize the economy and attract foreign investment. However, it led to an unprecedented rise in fuel prices, which cascaded into increased costs of goods and services, plunging the majority of Nigerians into severe financial distress. In addition to the economic strain, the devaluation of the Nigerian naira further exacerbated the situation, making everyday commodities unaffordable for many. The frustration with these policies was palpable, especially among the youth who felt alienated and betrayed by a government that promised change but delivered hardship. This set the stage for the End Bad Governance protests, which began on August 1st, 2024. The protests initially started as peaceful demonstrations, with thousands of Nigerians taking to the streets, holding placards that reflected their discontent. Slogans like "Enough is enough" and "Stop anti-masses" policies echoed through major cities such as Lagos, Abuja, and Kano. The protesters, united under the banner of End Bad Governance, demanded not just economic relief but also a reversal of the controversial policies that had led to the crisis. However, the government's response was swift and severe. On the very first day of the protests, security forces, including the Nigerian army and police, attempted to disperse the crowds using tear gas and live ammunition. This heavy-handed approach resulted in the deaths of at least 22 protesters, with hundreds more injured and arrested. The violence only served to fuel the protests, transforming them from a local movement into a national outcry against state brutality and misgovernance. One of the most striking features of the End Bad Governance protests was the involvement of Nigeria's youth. Over the years, young Nigerians have become increasingly disillusioned with the political class, feeling that their voices are neither heard nor considered in the decision-making process. The 2024 protests were not their first foray into activism. Movements like Chunk NSARS in 2020 had already showcased the power of youth-led protests in challenging the status quo. Social media played a crucial role in mobilizing support for the protests. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram became tools for organizing, spreading information, and rallying international support. The hashtag #EndBadGovernance trended globally, bringing attention to the plight of Nigerians. The youth leveraged these platforms not only to coordinate protests, but also to document and expose the actions of the security forces, countering the state-controlled narrative presented by traditional media. A notable and controversial aspect of the 2024 protests was the emergence of pro-Russian sentiments among some protesters. In the northern states of Kaduna and Kano, demonstrators were seen waving Russian flags and calling for Russian President Vladimir Putin's intervention. This development sparked a diplomatic row, with Nigerian authorities labeling the act as treasonous and accusing Russia of meddling in the country's internal affairs. The presence of Russian flags was interpreted by some as a sign of growing resentment towards Western influence, particularly given the perception that the economic policies of the Tinubu administration were influenced by Western financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The Russian embassy in Abuja, however, distanced itself from the protests, stating that the flags were a personal choice of the protesters and did not reflect any official position. This incident highlighted the broader geopolitical context in which the protests occurred, with Nigeria caught between the influences of the West and the rising presence of Russia in Africa, particularly in countries that have recently experienced military coups. The Nigerian government's fears of a possible coup inspired by the protests led to increased crackdowns and the imposition of curfews in several states. As the protests continued, the Nigerian government struggled to contain the unrest. President Bola Tinubu made several public appeals for calm, acknowledging the economic hardships faced by Nigerians and promising to address their concerns. However, these assurances did little to quell the anger on the streets. Instead, the protests grew, with more people joining from different parts of the country, including the usually politically passive southern regions. The government's attempts to suppress the protests through force only fueled further resentment. Reports of police brutality, unlawful arrests, and even extrajudicial killings began to surface, drawing condemnation from international human rights organizations like Amnesty International. The United Action Front of Civil Society also criticized the government's handling of the protests, calling for an end to the violence and the immediate release of detained protesters. In response to the escalating violence, several states, including Kaduna, Kano, and Borno, imposed 24-hour curfews. However, these measures were largely ignored by the protesters, who saw them as further evidence of the government's disregard for their rights and grievances. The situation reached a critical point when calls for a national strike began to circulate, threatening to bring the entire country to a standstill. As the End Bad Governance protests wound down, a critical question emerged: what next? While the protests had succeeded in drawing attention to the economic and political issues plaguing Nigeria, there was a growing realization that street protests alone were insufficient to bring about lasting change. Historians and political analysts have suggested that for Nigerian youth to effect real change, they must move beyond protests and engage more directly in the political process. This includes forming or joining political parties, running for office, and holding elected officials accountable. The lessons from other movements across Africa, such as the Arab Spring, underscore the importance of translating protest energy into sustained political engagement. Moreover, there is a need for the establishment of mechanisms to monitor and evaluate government policies continuously. Youth-led initiatives that focus on policy evaluation, government accountability, and public advocacy could play a crucial role in shaping Nigeria's political future. The creation of such bodies, coupled with increased political participation, could help ensure that the demands of the End Bad Governance protests are not forgotten once the crowds disperse. The End Bad Governance protests of 2024 marked a significant moment in Nigeria's history. They were a stark reminder of the power of collective action in challenging state authority and demanding better governance. However, they also highlighted the limitations of protest movements in achieving systemic change. As Nigeria moves forward, the challenge will be to channel the energy and passion of the protests into sustained political engagement that can bring about the economic and social reforms that the country desperately needs. The future of Nigeria's democracy may well depend on it. I hope you found this video informative. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update.